Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for attending this talk track. My name is Antoinette Houston. I am an experience lead with Salesforce. And what that means is I basically help lead small research and design teams across a number of different types of engagements, research and design focused, anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks, smaller scale engagements to larger enterprise-wide transformational implementation projects. Today, the subject is really near and dear to my heart, which is all about how to keep the user and the experience at the center. And basically, what I mean by that is top of mind, right? At the focus throughout any sort of research and design engagement. And throughout my almost 20 years in the space, I've definitely had some best practices and some lessons learned that I just want to go through with you guys. And hopefully at the end, you guys can kind of talk to me about maybe some examples that maybe you've used with some similar techniques. Okay, so let's jump right in. Many of you have probably seen some of these same design principles located here in the light blue circles, right? Looking at our users and or customers and or employees habits as they're going through a particular day, workflow, process, etc. What are their mindsets, right? As they're going through these things, what are those change agents, right? Like what's prompting a change in their behavior, what's prompting a change in maybe an experience that's supposed to happen. Obviously, ethics and inclusion has been a huge factor and should continue to be a huge factor in looking at research practices as well as design elements as well. And what does the future look like, right? I mean, I think we've all kind of seen this if we worked within a design space. But a lot of times the focus is still just the user, right? User first. The user is not like me, right? I mean, the crux of UCD has been that. But I found that a parallel sort of effort should happen, right? Both that user and that experience should always be top of mind, not only because of these design elements, right? Because this is just the start, but also just because of different shifts and ebbs and flows that happen that I'll talk about in a second. So I think it's really key to understand not just what a user, customer, employee is doing, right? Not just what their pain points are, just not what their gaps are, right? But why? Context is really, really critical when just attempting to create good experiences and especially great experiences. And then also, how do we do that, right? How do we kind of have this parallel sort of effort? And the principle that I created is called the AIOU method. And it's just a set of principles, a framework, if you will, that helps you kind of keep both of those parallel efforts straight center. So, as I spoke about before, UCD as a practice has always talked about having users be top of mind, always be at the center. But I don't know about you. I've had a lot of challenges with that throughout my almost 20 years in this space. And I would love for you guys to maybe share some of your challenges especially if they, if you agree with what I have here, or if you have some additional ones that are not necessarily listed here. But I found that there have been three central challenges or three themes of challenges that I've faced in my career. One has been little to no research, right? So it's kind of hard to keep the user or anything top of mind when you don't actually have the door to do critical UX research, right? Either because of time constraints, maybe there have been lack of UX resources. I've certainly been a team of one a number of times in my career. UX is not defined as essential, right? So either product is leading that, or maybe engineering is leading the priorities around that. Or once you do get the green light, there's no real data integration done, right? So I've done all this great research and it's a great report or a great series of reports and it sits on the shelf somewhere, right? It's like, what are we going to do with it? How is it going to tie back in to the larger conversation of what's needed? Or talking to the wrong people, right? Who's really getting the most benefit from the design experiences that we're creating, right? Have we asked those questions? Who are really the target personas and have they been defined? Who's been defining those, right? And what's the experience level of that target audience? Is it all just novice or naive users, or is there a good segmentation across their experience level? For me, I always kind of lean towards the latter, at least in the engagements that I've been a part of. And then this whole like idea of the business point of view over everything. Let me be clear. I love working with business users. I love working with SMEs. I love working with stakeholders. But I have worked for some organizations where there's this idea that, well, we know our users, really, right? Where's the research to kind of help vet that? And so I think that there's this there's been this idea of sometimes this assumptive sort of behavior that have really led to some poor experiences in my day. And so kind of looking at business priorities, failure to take into the real needs that need to be, just kind of looked at. So looking at those challenges, right? Right. As well as looking at these shifts that continue to happen, for me, makes keeping both the user and the experience even more critical, right? Who are we doing this for? Why are we doing it? And are we making this experience malleable enough and flexible enough to really ebb and flow with the challenges that we know are around, right? As well as these shifts that continue to occur, shifts in business priority, shifts in user needs and wants, shifts in technology as it should, right? Grow and scale, but also environmental factors, right? We're dealing with that with COVID-19 and just the whole idea of having a more remote sort of world. And I don't know about you guys, but how many of you have ever dealt with what I would call this de facto out of the box mentality? I would love to see a plus one in the chat if you guys have ever dealt with this, where it's like if you're working with a software company or a services company that just says, well, our software can get them there 80-20 rule. 80% of our features can fix their issues. And maybe so, but I don't necessarily think that that's a de facto sort of mentality that should be used for every client, every team, right? Every person. But sometimes that happens. And so, given the challenges that I spoke about, given the shifts that I just spoke about too, I love this graphic because it's really just trying to show in the midst of all of those design principles still being at the anchor, right? Not a monolith, but still being at the anchor. There's still this balance, right? That I always try to keep where it's like, again, understanding that user ecosystem and really being able to create these flexible design systems or design experiences that are going to help with these shifts and these ebbs and these flows, right? Where does that come from? Think of it like the trust circle. So if you have a trust circle, I'm a UX researcher, right? And I'm mainly a qualitative researcher and strategist. So when I think about this, I think about if I'm building and capturing that user trust, right? They trust that what they're going to say to me, the insights that I'm providing are going to be safe enough where one, I'm going to roll them back into the experience. But two, I'm going to actually highlight that within the experience back to them so that now it's not just an over the fence sort of experience. It's like, okay, I trust that what I'm telling my research and design team is actually being listened to. They understand my pain. They understand the gaps that I'm experiencing. They understand the why around these workarounds that I'm doing. They understand the processes, right? And not just in the sense of writing business requirements, right? But actually making the experience better. And I see that in the experience. And now as I go through, they're actually coming back and they're testing it with me. They're having conversations with me about conversations that have been had, about insights that have been gathered. There's a continual sort of relationship that happens. And when that has happened, at least for me, that's been the greatest experience that I can share. And I would love to know if you guys have had that same experience. To help me do that, I've created this framework called the AIOU. And it's really a set of principles, but they're set to help build that user trust, right? Because again, if no one wants to talk to you, if no one wants to be honest with you about what's really going on, from the time that they log in to not even the time that they log out, but even after that, when they go home and think about the work they have to do the next day, that's a whole sort of experience that we want to make sure that we're capturing so that we know what is going to make not just a good experience, but a great one. So the AIOU stands for each letter, right? Is basically an acronym, right? And I'm going to go through what I mean by each one. And again, if you can kind of resonate with it, we'd love to see a plus one in the chat. And let's go from there. I'm really excited about it. I hope you are too. So the A. The A stands for actively listen for not just the what, but the why. I spoke about earlier how it's one thing to get a set of pain points, right? Okay, this is what's happening. Great. But why? Context is so key. And I think to end up doing that, you kind of have to um, remove any sort of biases, any sort of assumptions before you go into that engagement with that particular user group, customer group, or employee group, because understanding matters, right? You get to understand their mental models, you get to understand not only their pains, right? But maybe do a pain point analysis and carve out what's a pain, what's a barrier, what's a hindrance, what's a gap, what's the difference between those three or four things. And then also understanding why they're doing a particular workaround. I've worked for so many organizations where workarounds have been looked at as a negative, but they're not sometimes, right? I think what I hear when I hear workaround is flexibility and being able to have multiple ways of doing things. So, in the experience that my team and I are building, we don't want to remove that um, that sort of idea of being able to complete a process or complete a flow in different ways. Just something to think about. And I always say the why retains the will, right? The willingness to keep high adoption. How many of you have worked with organizations that want to, like one of their key value indicators, right, is high adoption, right? If you don't understand the crux of the issue, then how can you even feel as though you're going to design something that's going to have users, have customers, have employees want to use this system? They can use it. Do they want to use it? That's the difference. Willingness to explore new functionality, right? Have you ever worked with users where sometimes they're a bit nervous about, well, I don't know what this is? Or have you designed an experience where it promotes that sort of like new way of working, right? That exploration into a new feature or function. And the willingness to trust the future innovation, right? So now that they trust you, and hopefully now that they see themselves within that experience, now they're able to say, okay, well, I definitely want to be part of the next phase of research that's happening because I see that you guys are listening and I see myself, right? It's a inclusive sort of experience. And I found in my line of work, that's everything. Trust is everything. The E is for empathy. I'm sure you guys have all heard this before as well. I look at it a little different. User empathy, I do feel as though is at the heart of building that trust relationship with my ecosystem, but it involves all the senses, right? It's not just about coming in and doing an active listening sort of exercise, but it's really about what are they not saying, right? Why did that eye shift to the left or right? Why are they? Why is that like body shifting like that? Why are you slumped over? Why'd you sit back like that? Right? It's those sort of nonverbal cues that sometimes tell a whole story within themselves. And also removing those biases and assumptions, as I spoke about earlier, really putting yourself in the shoes of your customer, in the shoes of your users, in the shoes of those humans, right? That you're creating that design experience for is so key. And being a developer back in the day, it wasn't common sense to me. So this was something that was like an aha moment for me as I kind of grew in this space of like really stepping into the day to day of what my ecosystem is going through. And so it's focusing on those needs, not necessarily pushing a product or pushing a service or pushing any software, but it's really about what do they need? What is that qualitative palette? Right. And being data scientists, a lot of times we focus on the quantitative. I'm more so looking at the qualitative and how those sentiments are scaling across my ecosystem and focusing on their behavior and the sentiments shared. I is for imagine, right? Imagine and keep the design experience malleable, right? So now that flexibility is coming back into play. I always say the ability to nurture and retain the trust through change. That's the win because we know it's going to change, right? We know that nothing's going to stay the same. And so, as I spoke about earlier, as business, user, and technology needs shift, so should the experience, right? How many of you have dealt with a either small, medium, or large scale sort of engagement where because that design was inflexible, thousands of dollars were spent, right? Thousands of dollars were lost because it just was going in one way, right? That there was nothing malleable about that. And what a disservice that is, I think, when you don't think about how to make it as flexible as possible. So for me, most times one size cannot fit all, right? One solution for one client is not necessarily the best solution for another. And it's not about perfection, right? For me, it's about persistence. I'm persistently having touch points with my ecosystem. I'm consistently letting them know, either via surveys, check-ins, forums, one-on-ones, some sort of engagement, to say, this is what we've learned. This is what we've done. This is what we've learned. This is what we've done. So it's a constant traceability, sort of just experience across, right? That's transparent, right? This data is transparent. I'm not hiding it from anyone. And also knowing my audience and knowing the type of information that I'm providing to them, right? So how am I integrating that and highlighting the data insights across leadership, across stakeholders, across the end users, whether that's lunch and learns, whether that's leadership scorecards, um, obviously reporting. But what is that story and that narrative that I'm telling, and how am I telling that along the way? Right. We'll love to get your insight as to maybe how you've shared your data insights in a consistent and persistent way throughout certain engagements as well. The O is for optimize, right? Optimize aha moments into moments that matter. What do I mean by aha moments, right? Aha moment could be a couple different things. I put it this way. You can have an aha moment that actually validates or verifies what your stakeholders have told you about what they feel like the experience or the pains that their users are going through, right? That's one. So you hear something from your users and you're like, oh, okay, that checks. But also an aha moment is when you hear something that you just didn't know. You're like, are you serious? I You kind of like blown away. But it means nothing if you don't make that into a moment that matters, right? So for me, those are the times where I'm taking those insights and I'm like, okay, how can we shake things up? How can we innovate, right? How can we provide these designs that not only can be used, but they want to use them. They're excited about it, right? um, those are the things that I feel like can lead to these like huge organizational changes, transformational change. And when you talk about streamlining processes, we talk about, having this effect across different business units and across different teams. Those are the things that matter, right? What did you learn and how did you filter and fuel that back into the experience in a way that's monumental, right? That really makes that difference. And lastly, you is about understanding the user ecosystem that you're designing for. Really, the crux of this whole presentation, right? Having a marriage between the research and the designs, and having it unite, right? Obviously, maybe I'm biased, but user research is essential to design in my practice. So identifying who you're designing for, right? Knowing your audience and being open to the fact that it could be more than what you are initially being given from your leadership teams, but helping really voice their needs, their challenges, their gaps, their context. Context is key, and the opportunities, right? And then focusing on what the benefits are over the features. So, how can you create a questionless experience, right? If you know your users so well, how can you provide something to them that's going to allow them to say, huh, I don't even have to think about it? That's the win. Are there any questions? I know we have a couple of minutes left. Don't see any questions on here, so I'm going to assume that everything I said was just so riveting that you guys didn't have any questions. Um, but I do sincerely hope that you guys will take the AEIOU framework and do your own activities within your own organization and really kind of figure out what works for you and what doesn't. But think of it this way: the AEIOU leads to the why, right? And if you look at the fact that they're all vowels, vowels are, for me, the foundation of language. And I personally use the AEIOU as the foundation to help me keep both the user and that experience at the center. And hopefully, You guys will too. Thanks, guys. Yes, yes, I definitely will be able to share my slides for sure. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think in terms of, creating a narrative, I agree, Corinne. You don't necessarily need a lot of text. I think it's good to have a balance between like the main point that you're trying to convey and having some sort of visual to help support that, especially when presenting to executives, right? Because I found that they're really about the key metrics, right? So having a playing around with different types of charts and graphs are really key. Just being able to kind of speak about that within the first 7 to 15 seconds of whatever that critical metric that you're trying to get out, I found is key. Right, I'll show a chart. I'll hit that particular that particular point that I'm trying to get to, right? And then I'll ask them, like, I'll either give an example, I'll give them a sense of like whatever, like especially if it's like usability testing, whatever like behavior that I saw, and then I'll try to make it as engaging as I can to kind of get that feedback back and forth with them. But you would never see a slide. For executives where you have like blocks of text from me because you lose them right away. 5 seconds, you lose them. So I think it's a balance between main data point and some sort of like maybe bar graph or a line graph that kind of helps support that point for sure. Okay. If there are no other questions, and Karan, and I hope I'm saying your name right. Let me know if that answered your question for sure. They should be, right? Which is always interesting because report visuals can be somewhat subjective, right? Something that's explanatory to you may not be to the actual audience, right? I found in my case, I like to go through my report with either team members or even like my manager, right? To just make sure that the story that I'm trying to convey is clear, right? And how I'm conveying that story. It's still subjective, right? Because someone else may say, right, that's great. And then, right. So it's kind of a chance you take. But I would encourage you to just kind of have some mock presentation deliveries to either your team members, fellow colleagues, manager, etc. And then, if nothing else, just get the feedback from what they feel as though you're trying to present. And if it hits the mark, great. If it doesn't, we can always tweak and pivot along the way. Great. I'm glad that that helped. All right. Okay. There are no other questions. Again, thank you guys so much for attending this talk. I hope that it was, helpful. I hope you gathered some good insights. And again, I hope you will take the AIOU method and just kind of make it your own. And definitely feel free to email me. My email is ahouston@salesforce.com. I'm also available on LinkedIn. If you have any additional follow up or questions, or even just kind of want to chat about maybe some different sort of activities that I've used within those principles to help keep, again, the user and experience at the center. So thank you guys so much. Yep, the email is in the chat. Thank you, guys.